Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. This morning, we're going to discuss the war in Ukraine. And before anyone tries to use the predictable deflection of, this ain't got nothing to do with no black folks, just remember the last time we had some clowns who were trying to use that deflection, they were doing it to explain away why black people shouldn't be concerned about Kyle Rittenhouse. We have a lot of intellectually lazy black people with weak minds who try to make their intellectual feebleness sound noble with the cop-out that, what's this got to do with us? Not surprisingly, these are the least informed people in the room. They're also the same ones who have not done anything for black empowerment, and the only thing they're qualified to talk about is the last basketball game they saw, the last hip-hop song that they heard, or the last rerun of Tyler Perry's latest show that they watched. We need black people who aren't looking for some excuse not to use their brain. First of all, the system of white supremacy is global. Everything that moves on this planet that is not controlled by us, and that's practically everything, moves because white supremacy wants it to move. I'll be explaining the white supremacist connection in more depth in just a moment, but first of all, a little bit of background. Why is this going on? It's going on because when the old Soviet Union finally cracked up and fell apart in the late 1980s, a number of the non-Russian satellite states wound up breaking away. Now, starting in the 90s, the U.S. decided that the old Soviet Union was not going to be allowed to reconstitute itself, not under another name, not at all. So what happened was the U.S. started making entreaties to some of those old Soviet bloc countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, etc., and asking them to join NATO. Now, NATO, for those of you who don't remember, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was put together by the United States specifically as an alliance of nations to gang up on Russia, or vice versa. If Russia comes against one of them, all of them gang up on Russia. That's what NATO is about. That's the purpose of NATO. It is a specifically anti-Russian military organization. That's what NATO is about. So, if you're a lifelong career KGB agent, like, say, Vladimir Putin, who just got through watching his former employer crumble to dust, and he sees the former countries of the Soviet Union now running into the waiting arms of the United States and making agreements that once they've done this, Russia would have to go to nuclear war with the U.S. to get them back, what comes to your mind? Well, what came to the Russians' mind was we need the U.S. to make an agreement with us that they'll stop doing that. Well, you know how it is with these white supremacists. There's no honor among thieves. So the United States did, at least on paper, tell the Russians, sure, we're not going to be expanding NATO any further east. We just got one or two countries that signed up and we won't be signing up anymore. Well, you know how that one turned out. They just kept on signing countries up. It's kind of like Israel with the so-called settlements in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. You guys keep building Israeli houses where the Palestinians' homes that you blew up used to be. Well, it just kind of worked out like that. That's how the United States has been treating the expansion of NATO, coming further and further east. Hell, half the countries in NATO joined after 1997. That's almost a decade after the Berlin Wall fell. And countries were still joining NATO as late as 2020. Now, officially, the position that Russia had was, their big problem was that these countries could be used as staging grounds for operations by the U.S. against Russia, which they know is ridiculous. The U.S. military is not going to war with Russia, at least they're not going to be starting a war because everybody's got nukes now. The real reason, however, was Vladimir Putin wanted to reconstitute the old Soviet Union. It's a pet project of his. He's had this one on the drawing board for about 20 years now. And every time one of those Central European countries joins NATO, that's another country that he cannot go after because it would bring him into a direct war with the United States. And all of that NATO expansion creeping closer and closer to Russia's border. The U.S.'s name for this policy is containment, and it's been pursuing a similar strategy against China. Obviously, Putin has noticed. How could he not? And that's the reason why he's invaded Ukraine and why it is that he intends to conquer the entire country. Make no mistake, he wants all of Ukraine, not just Donetsk and Luhansk, or however it's pronounced. He didn't just go after those two small provinces. He launched a simultaneous attack on all sides, especially from the north. This is the reason why his alliance with the dictator in Belarus was so important to him. Not only because Belarus is one of those former Soviet bloc countries that, at least as an ally of Russia, will not fall into the NATO column, but also because they're right on the border with Ukraine, and that means they are a convenient staging ground for an invasion of that country. Everyone's finding out now just how homesick Vladimir Putin was for the old Soviet Union. You probably heard how he's been quoted as having said that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, for a leader of Russia to say that is kind of ridiculous. Russia lost more lives than any other country in World War II. You could seriously say that a big part of the price tag for stopping the Third Reich was paid for in Russian deaths. When Stalin took over, untold millions of Russians died due to his farming program, which was actually just a mass starvation program. The two greatest single causes of loss of life for the Russians. And Vladimir Putin ignores both of those and says those weren't the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. The greatest one was the end of the political system that was supposed to give me a pension. Now, the fact that he could say that tells you everything you need to know about him. And you know who he reminds me of with a line like that? These white supremacists here in the U.S., the ones you see waving the Confederate flag, who wax poetic about the old South and states' rights, etc., and who say that America ended in the mid-19th century. You know the types who I'm talking about. Whenever they give a timeline of when the U.S. stopped being the United States, it always goes back to that period. These neo-Confederates mourn the end of the Old South the way Vladimir Putin mourns the end of the Soviet Union. They both want to return to yesteryear, and for the exact same reasons. This is why Vladimir Putin is so loved and adored by the white right. These are the same chumps who were such anti-Russian, anti-communist, right? And here they are spending the better part of the last 10 years or so having a bromance with the arch-Russian communist. But for these white supremacists, race trumps political ideology. It's the most important thing to them. Capitalism, communism, democracy, autocracy, these words don't matter because all of those terms are fluid. It doesn't really matter who it is that you're speaking to. The only thing that is actually concrete and solid for them, unchangeable, immutable, is race, white power, white identity. Now, there's no way that you can change that. You can't alter that. You can't have it under another name either. And the fact these guys have done such a quick and total flip-flop on communism, from hating them to embracing them and making a hero out of one of them, that shouldn't surprise you. Not if you've been listening to the black media, it shouldn't. White supremacy believes in taking both sides of the conversation. Thank you, Neely Fuller. Today's conservative becomes tomorrow's liberal and vice versa, if they think it will suit their interests. Cenk Uygur was a so-called conservative. He only switched to liberal because there were too many Rush Limbaugh wannabes when he was trying to get into the media, and Uygur couldn't find a radio station that would hire him. Joe Scarborough was a Republican congressman, part of Newt Gingrich's 1994 Republican Revolution, no less. Today, Scarborough has denounced the Republican Party and said that he's no longer a member of it. Dave Rubin was best buds with the Young Turks, but I guess they weren't paying him enough, so he decided to go right-wing. Steve Schmidt was a lifelong GOP strategist. He worked for John McCain. But when Trump came to power and made McCain a pariah, Steve Schmidt was on the outs too, so now he's a full-time critic of the Republicans. He was one of the founders of the so-called Lincoln Project. Donald Trump. Putting his anti-black racism aside, Trump has always been left of center on things like LGBT issues, abortion. He was a typical New York Democrat most of his life. He even gave money to Hillary Clinton. But when Trump wanted to gain some real power and run for president, he knew that the field of Democrats was far too crowded for him to be able to break through. So he stayed quiet on issues like LGBT rights, and he played up the one thing that he and the Republicans had in common: being openly, blatantly anti-black racists. And yeah, the Democrats are just as bad, but their entire shtick, their entire con game is that they're not openly blatant about it. That's their game if you're simple enough to fall for it. And you notice how similar Donald Trump's little turn was to Cenk Uygur. You notice that. But I think the best example of white supremacists who switched sides for the sake of maintaining white power was in 1964, when LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act. Then all of those white Southern Democrats abandoned the Democratic Party overnight as a group, and they all suddenly became Republicans. The party of Lincoln was just fine with them now. But you see my point, the white supremacists are never so committed to a particular affiliation or title that they won't drop it in a heartbeat if it serves their thirst for power. It's interesting seeing all of these white media and white governmental types getting their noses bent out of joint about Putin. It's because they're seeing what it's like to have to deal with someone who's like themselves. This is what it's like for black people having to deal with them. Vladimir Putin is the geopolitical equivalent of what happens when you have white supremacists who think that no one can punish them. And just like with all these white mass shooters, you got people who are saying, Putin's crazy, Putin's crazy. No. See, that's their little dodge that they have to use so they can say, we're normal, there's nothing wrong with us. The problem with Putin is not that he's crazy. He's not crazy at all. He's a regular, typical white supremacist. We see them all the time in this society. Tens of millions of them, which is why Putin is fully willing to raise the specter of a nuclear war and end the world just to snatch some real estate. Because for these people, survival is not at the top of their list of priorities. Power is. If they can't have power over other people, then they'd rather not even be alive. They see their identity as being in charge, and they define their power in terms of who is beneath them, which is supposed to be everyone, especially black people. They are supreme. But supremacy cannot exist inside a vacuum. It requires someone lesser to compare itself to so that the supreme person can feel supreme. Like those old Confederates like Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms, who said that if the white race is not in charge of America, then the U.S. should fall to dust never to rise again. Or in many cases, if you have these white businesses who, if they think they're going to get bought out by a black person or a black person's going to be in charge, they'd rather let the business just go under. This is why so many of the white media and white government are worried. They know how Putin is because he's just like them. Putin is no different than your average garden variety white supremacist who is completely confident that no matter what he does, no one can punish him. We see all these white people going crazy about him acting out because they know he's interested in taking aim at their interests too. That's why they're opposed to him. Now, white supremacy's endless thirst for power resulted in them having the ability to blow the whole doggone planet up. So unfortunately, this is not one of those situations that we're going to be able to ignore. That's not to say we're taking sides. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke put it, this is an argument between two groups of thugs about which one of them is going to be in charge of us. Now, the most important question that's relevant to black people is, could this go all the way bad? Well, that depends largely on the Russian military. Vladimir Putin has had 20 years to pack the army with a bunch of stooges, flunkies, and yes-men. Putin said that his big concern was he didn't want NATO being right up against the borders of Russia. Well, up until a couple of days ago, Ukraine was not a NATO nation, and the U.S. was not going to add them because they got too much corruption. There's certain guidelines and criteria that nations wanting to be part of NATO have to meet, and Ukraine was a long way from that. But by conquering Ukraine and adding it to Russia, Putin is now going to make it where Russia will now have NATO nations right there on their border. The very thing that he claimed he was trying to avoid. But since when do white supremacists actually fear the very thing that they claim to fear? If Putin's generals want to keep their dachas, that means cottages out in the country. If they want to keep drinking vodka, eating caviar, and patronizing their mistresses, then maybe they'll decide that they're not willing to give all that up for him. Maybe they're not willing to risk losing everything just for this guy. Putin himself happens to have, allegedly, according to the white media, dude's got a couple $1 billion that he's squirreled away. Lucky him. He also has 2 or 3 children. I believe the number is actually 3, though he never mentions them. There's not even many pictures of him with his kids. And what does that tell you? This doesn't sound like a man who is willing to risk blowing up the world, not if he can help it anyway. Sounds like a man who wants to protect his children and wants to make sure that they have one hell of an inheritance. So no, I don't think that Putin wants a nuclear war. I don't think he wants to risk it, though I think, considering how ambitious this little bit of grand theft is, he certainly would like for people to think that he does, so at the very least, hopefully he can get away with as much as he can steal while people are thinking to themselves, does he or does he not? And what about a return to status quo ante? That means what the situation was before. Well, that's going to largely depend on the Ukrainian resistance. That's what they're going to be before this is all over. And what's the long-term military outlook for that? Hard to say. The Ukrainians have been resisting Putin's annexation of Crimea after he took it in 2014. They've pretty much been resisting him ever since there. But at that point, up until this week, the Ukrainians had control of the other 90% of the country. They had a government who could resupply and reinforce them. They don't have that now. Not for this situation, they don't. And while Ukraine is certainly not as bad as Afghanistan when it comes to low morale, the truth of the matter is they still had a corrupt government nonetheless, and what this has done is it's left them in a far weaker position than they would have been otherwise. So already the Ukrainians have left Vladimir Putin having to fight a rearguard action against them in other parts of Ukraine that he's gobbled up. They could very well continue fighting an insurgency against him. Keep in mind, that's part of the reason why Putin had to take Crimea, because the people rose up with a little bit of help from the U.S. Oh, what the hell, with all the help from the U.S. They rose up and kicked out Vladimir Putin's puppet government and then immediately replaced that one with a U.S. puppet government. But any would-be Ukrainian resistance is absolutely going to require supplies and armament and intelligence from the US and its Western allies. But again, Ukraine is not Afghanistan. This is not a place where 99.9% of the people are not ethnic Caucasians, or at least not ethnic Russians politically, if not necessarily racially. It's not a country that Vladimir and his friends don't know much about, and it's also not a country that's very far away from Russia where it's a real hassle to have to get there. This is right on Russia's doorstep, and in a few more weeks it's probably going to be part of Russia. So what that means is Vladimir is going to be in a pretty good position to at least keep an eye on things, a very strong eye on things. So supplying and sustaining an insurgency against the Russians in Ukraine, that's going to be an uphill climb. Now, there is something else that I feel compelled to mention, and I know this is probably going to be way off base, but I still have to say it because it's on my mind. Has anyone else noticed that Vladimir Putin doesn't look so well these days? He's gained a lot of weight. This is a man who made it a point to run around shirtless every chance he got and display what for him is physical fitness. Oh, he was quite the picture of vanity. And now, well, he looks like he went straight from the Kremlin to the KFC. He's 69 years old now, so he's no spring chicken. And again, I'm probably reading a little bit too much into this, but do any of you Gen Xers remember who Vladimir Putin's immediate predecessor was? Boris Yeltsin. Now, Boris Yeltsin was always an overweight man, but he drank a lot and he ate nothing but junk food. He made it a point to go to outdoor rallies, and when he did, he wanted to show the people how robust he was, and he could drink and he could dance. Oh, he showed all of this energy when he was in front of the cameras, whenever he was in front of the people. Well, he showed as much energy and vigor as an old, morbidly obese white man can muster. But my point is that on the outside, Boris Yeltsin looked totally fine, or at least that's what people in the West thought. But Yeltsin and his advisors, they knew that it was all a front. His health was declining. It came as a surprise to everybody when in 1999, Yeltsin announced that he was going to be resigning. And when he made that televised address to his nation, he looked tired, like he was on his last legs. He looked like an old hog who knew that he was on his way to the slaughterhouse. Of course, his chosen successor was the then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. After that, nobody saw or heard from Yeltsin again until he died some years later. Now, like a lot of you, I saw the video of Putin grilling his intelligence chief or one of his senior advisors the other day, and it looked like Putin had half a mustache. What I mean here is he was on camera and he looked like he hadn't completely shaved. Keep in mind, this man is a career KGB agent. This is a man who believes in having control of his entire environment. That kind of thing is not exactly like him. And especially considering that this man already knew that he was about to start a war. He knew exactly what kind of crap storm was going to rain down on him because of this. And here he is packing on all that weight. Now, maybe I'm just reading too much into things, but from where I stand, looking at Putin and judging by his behavior, he looks to me like he may be in poor health. At least by my reading, he seems to be acting like it. I wouldn't be surprised if something is going on. That doesn't mean, by the way, that Vladimir Putin's going to drop dead next week. Even as poor as Boris Johnson's health was, he still didn't actually die until 7 years after he abdicated the presidency to Putin. And a guy like Putin, he's not just going to saunter off to some cottage somewhere. Nah, he's going to hold on to the presidency until his dying breath, or at least until he's one leg in the grave and the other leg dangling. Like all old men who still have power, Putin starts looking for shortcuts to get done all the things that he should have done earlier in life. He knows he'll never be able to reconstitute the old Soviet Union. NATO has checkmated him on that one, so instead he's picking off some of the non-NATO aligned border nations as his consolation prizes. But the main lesson that I hope that we take away from this is the reason why we don't want these white supremacists to be in power. Every white empire has fallen to dust, leaving nothing to follow it. The problem is the white supremacists now control the world. They have a global anti-black empire. So when these fools inevitably fall, they now have the ability to take the world with them. Hell, a lot of them would prefer it. Too many black people follow that everyone's holding hands colorblind nonsense, and this is why that's suicide. We can't pretend that these white supremacists think like we do, or that they're motivated by the same things that we are. We're talking about a culture that is totally defined by warfare, as Dr. John Henry Clark put it. Everything that moves under these white supremacists moves for the sake of war. In Africa, the history of the people is typically defined by the life of the king. Now, in our culture here in the U.S., those of us who came out of slavery in this country, our history has been defined by our freedom fighters, by our artists and thinkers, even by our athletes and entertainers. But our history is not defined by who we have gone to war with or attempted to subjugate. The history of Europe, on the other hand, is a history of war. If a king or a leader didn't fight a war, then they're completely and thoroughly ignored. When the European talks about doing something to ensure that they're remembered forever, you can bet whatever it is they got on their mind is going to be some act of ghastly violence. This is why we get all of these white mass shooters. Their main reason for doing it is because they want people to remember them. Unfortunately, we're not in a position to guide events, and that's really a shame because even without the prospect of total global annihilation, as black people, we should be able to shape the fate of the world that we live in. That's just called being a human being. But until we get our Black Empowerment Act together, we're going to be relegated to mere observers. And this is not the kind of situation that you necessarily want to be just a passive witness to. Let this be a lesson to us. You don't like the idea of wondering if today is the day that these suicidal white supremacists finally destroy the world? Well, you're going to need power if you're going to change that. Good day. And be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Earth Angel, Eve, Ginger Vine, Gwendolyn Langston, and Roxanne Allen. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.